Me and my crew of the Velvet Underworld channels would really love to hear how things are going on at your place, or you could share it to the comment sections so that we could connect with each other. Uh, we would love to build a community of people who love touching stories about mafia bosses. Now, let's enjoy today's stories, shall we?
Footsteps echoed against the marble floors of the gallery, sharp and deliberate. Lorenzo adjusted his cuffs, his mind consumed by the impending shipyard strike until a tiny hand tugged at his tailored trousers. He looked down into wide green eyes, completely unaware this child would dismantle his entire empire. Lorenzo Costa did not believe in ghosts. In his line of work, the dead stayed in the ground. As the undisputed head of the Chicago syndicate, he had personally put enough men there to know that the earth did not yield its secrets easily. Yet, standing in the sweltering humidity of the Lincoln Park Conservatory, he was about to realize that some ghosts breathe. The conservatory had been locked down for the afternoon. It was the only way Lorenzo could hold a discreet meeting with Alderman Richard Gregory without the FBI breathing down his neck. The glacis walls, fogged with condensation, provided the perfect veil. The meeting had concluded 10 minutes ago, the alderman scurrying away with a briefcase heavier than when he arrived. Lorenzo, however, had lingered in the fern room. The oppressive heat, smelling of damp soil and crushed leaves, grounded him. It was a rare moment of absolute silence in a life governed by gunfire and whispered betrayals. He signaled to his right-hand man, Matteo, who was standing like a sentinel near the wrought iron gates. "Give me 5 minutes," Lorenzo commanded, his voice a low baritone that left no room for argument. Matteo nodded silently, stepping out into the adjoining corridor and pulling the heavy glass door shut. Alone, Lorenzo let out a ragged breath. The humidity was ruining his bespoke Tom Ford suit. He shrugged off the dark charcoal jacket, draping it over a nearby stone bench, and began unfastening the silver cufflinks. He rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, exposing the thick cords of muscle in his forearms and the dark ink that stained his skin. He closed his eyes, tilting his head back to catch a stray bead of condensation dripping from the glass ceiling. "You're not supposed to be in here." The voice was tiny, no louder than the rustle of the fern fronds. Lorenzo's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively dropping to the holstered Sig Sauer concealed at his waist. He spun around, anticipating a threat. Instead, he found himself staring at a child. She couldn't have been older than 6. She stood about 3 feet tall, swallowed by an oversized yellow raincoat that was entirely unnecessary for the indoor climate. Her brown hair was a wild tangle of curls, and her eyes, a startling, vivid emerald green, stared up at him with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. Lorenzo relaxed his grip on his weapon, his brow furrowing in irritation. The perimeter was supposed to be secure. How had a child slipped past Matteo and the 4 other armed men stationed at the entrances? "Where are your parents, kid?" Lorenzo asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. He wasn't a monster. He didn't deal in children. "My mom is working," the little girl stated matter-of-factly, stepping closer to inspect him. "She told me to stay in the break room, but it was boring. I like the plants better." "You need to go back," Lorenzo said, turning away to retrieve his jacket. "This area is closed." "Why are you so sweaty?" she asked, completely ignoring his directive. She stepped right up to the stone bench, her head tilting as she examined his exposed arms. "Are you a gardener? You don't look like a gardener. You look like one of those mean men in movies." A harsh chuckle escaped Lorenzo's throat. "Something like that. Now, go." But the little girl wasn't moving. Her wide green eyes were fixated on Lorenzo's right forearm. The bravado instantly melted from her small face, replaced by profound confusion. She reached out a tiny, sticky finger and pointed at his skin. "My mom has that tattoo too," she whispered. The air in the conservatory seemed to vanish. Lorenzo froze, the world narrowing down to the child and the ink on his arm. It wasn't a generic piece of flash art. It was a weeping willow, its hanging branches intricately wrapped around a jagged silver dagger. At the base of the tree, barely visible, were the Roman numerals for the number 7. Lorenzo had paid Old Ink Jimmy, a legendary underground artist in Brooklyn, $50,000 to design it. Only 2 existed in the world. Lorenzo wore one. The other had been burned to ash in a warehouse fire 7 years ago. A cold sweat broke out across Lorenzo's neck, entirely unrelated to the tropical heat. He dropped his jacket and dropped to one knee, bringing himself eye level with the little girl. The intimidating aura of the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a desperate, frantic man. "What did you say?" Lorenzo's voice was a jagged rasp. He grabbed her small shoulders, perhaps a fraction too tight, but she didn't flinch. "The tree with the knife," the girl said, tracing the air above his arm. "My mom has it, right here." She patted her own left shoulder blade. "She tries to cover it up with special thick makeup when she goes to work, but I see it when she gives me baths. She cries when she looks at it." Lorenzo's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Left shoulder blade. It was the exact placement, but it was impossible. He had seen the charred wreckage of the car. He had paid Dr. Arthur Penhaligon at Northwestern Memorial a small fortune to confirm the dental records. He had stood in the freezing November rain and watched a mahogany casket be lowered into the dirt. "What is your name?" Lorenzo demanded, his dark eyes searching the child's face. Now that he looked closely, really looked, he saw the curve of the jaw, the unruly brown curls, the defiant tilt of the chin. "Sophie," she answered. "Sophie," Lorenzo repeated, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. "What is your mother's name?" Sophie frowned, taking a small step back. "Valerie. Her name is Valerie Dalton. Are you going to tell on me for being in here?" "Valerie." The name hit him like a physical blow. The walls of the conservatory spun. 7 years. 7 years of empty bottles, reckless wars with the Russian Bratva, and a hollow chest that felt nothing but rage. Valerie Dalton, the civilian art appraiser who had stumbled into his world, the woman who had made him want to burn his empire to the ground just to keep her safe. "Where is she, Sophie?" Lorenzo asked, his voice shaking. "Where is your mother right now?" Sophie pointed toward the frosted glass doors leading to the public wing of the botanical gardens. "She works at the Magnolia Cafe. She bakes the muffins." Lorenzo stood up slowly. He didn't bother putting his jacket back on. He strode to the heavy glass doors and shoved them open. Matteo was there instantly, hand reaching inside his coat. "Boss, what's wrong?" Matteo asked, taking in Lorenzo's pale face. "Lock down the public wing," Lorenzo ordered, his voice deadly quiet. "Seal every exit. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. If CPD shows up, buy them off. If they won't be bought, stall them. Do you understand?" Matteo swallowed hard. "Yes, boss." Lorenzo turned back to Sophie, extending a large, tattooed hand. "Come on, Sophie, let's go get a muffin." The walk from the private conservatory to the public pavilion felt like marching to an execution. Lorenzo's mind was a chaotic storm of memories and brutal calculations. If Valerie was alive, the dental records were forged. If the records were forged, someone inside his own family had orchestrated it. He held Sophie's small hand gently, acutely aware of how fragile she felt. 6 years old. Valerie had died, disappeared 7 years ago. The math slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Sophie wasn't just a child, she was his blood. The Magnolia Cafe was a quaint, sunlit spot nestled near the public orchid displays. The smell of roasted espresso and burnt sugar wafted through the air. There were only a few patrons, mostly elderly couples and students with laptops. Lorenzo's eyes scanned the counter, and then he stopped breathing completely. She was wiping down the espresso machine. Her back was to him. She was wearing a green apron over a simple white t-shirt, her brown hair pulled up into a messy bun secured by a pencil. She was thinner than he remembered, the elegant posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone carrying the weight of the world. But the curve of her neck, the way she shifted her weight to her left leg, it was branded into his soul. "Mom!" Sophie broke free from Lorenzo's grasp and ran toward the counter. The woman turned around. Lorenzo felt his knees threaten to buckle. It was Valerie. Fine lines framed her, striking green eyes, eyes identical to the child's, and she looked exhausted, but she was spectacularly, impossibly alive. Valerie crouched down to catch Sophie in a hug. "Soph, I told you to stay in the back room. It's not safe to wander." "I met a man, Mom. He has your tree tattoo." Valerie froze. Her hands gripped her daughter's arms tightly. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her gaze from the child to the entrance of the cafe. Her eyes locked onto Lorenzo. The color drained from her face so fast, Lorenzo thought she might faint. The coffee rag slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a wet slap. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The bustling noise of the cafe faded into a dull, echoing hum. Lorenzo saw the exact moment the shock in her eyes metastasized into absolute, unadulterated terror. She scrambled backward, pulling Sophie behind her, as if using her own body as a shield. "No!" she gasped out, her voice cracking. "No, no, please!" Lorenzo took a step forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Val, stay away from us!" Valerie screamed. Several patrons turned their heads, alarmed. Valerie didn't care. She looked frantically toward the kitchen doors. "Tony, call the police, now!" Lorenzo gestured sharply to the shadows near the entrance. Dante, another of his lieutenants, stepped forward and smoothly flipped the open sign to closed, locking the main doors and drawing the shades. The few patrons in the shop noticed the large, armed men at the exits and began to panic. "Everyone stay in your seats. Enjoy your coffee." "This is a private family matter," Lorenzo announced, his voice projecting a lethal calm that immediately silenced the room. He turned his attention back to Valerie, who was backing toward the staff hallway, clutching Sophie to her chest. Lorenzo walked toward her slowly, like approaching a cornered, wounded animal. "Let her go, Lorenzo," Valerie pleaded, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Kill me. Do whatever you came to do, but she's innocent. Please, God, she's innocent." Lorenzo stopped a few feet from her, the words hitting him like physical shrapnel. "Kill me?" "Valerie, what the hell are you talking about?" Lorenzo whispered, the heartbreak evident in his rough voice. "I mourned you. For 7 years, I have been half dead. I buried a box of ashes because I thought you were gone. Why would I kill you?" Valerie let out a bitter, choked sob. "Don't play games with me, not now. Carmine told me everything." Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. Carmine, his uncle, his underboss, the man who had held Lorenzo as he wept over Valerie's grave. "Carmine?" Lorenzo repeated dangerously. "He found me at the clinic," Valerie choked out, holding Sophie so tight the little girl whimpered. "The day I found out I was pregnant, Carmine was waiting for me in the parking lot. He told me you knew. He told me that an illegitimate child with a civilian was a liability to the Costa family, and you had ordered him to clean up the mess." Lorenzo stared at her, the horrific puzzle pieces snapping into place. "He said you were going to burn the warehouse with me inside it," Valerie continued, her voice shaking violently. "He said he was showing me mercy because I didn't know how this world worked. He gave me a fake ID, $10,000 in cash, and told me if I ever returned to Chicago, or if you ever found out I was alive, you would slaughter us both." Lorenzo felt a rage so pure, so absolute, it tasted like copper in his mouth. Carmine had orchestrated the warehouse fire. He had planted a body. He had faked the dental records. He had stolen the love of Lorenzo's life, and he had stolen 7 years of his daughter's life, all to maintain the purity and strength of the Costa bloodline. Lorenzo slowly sank to his knees right there on the sticky linoleum floor of the cafe. He ignored the stares of his men. He looked at Sophie, who was peeking out from behind her mother's legs, looking scared. "Valerie," Lorenzo said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He looked up at the woman he loved. "I never ordered a hit on you. I was going to ask you to marry me the night the warehouse burned down. I had the ring in my pocket." Valerie stared at him, her chest heaving, searching his dark eyes for the lie. She found none, only the devastating wreckage of a man who had just realized his entire life was built on a horrific betrayal. "She's yours," Valerie whispered finally, the fight leaving her body as she looked down at Sophie. "She's your daughter, Lorenzo." Lorenzo reached out a trembling hand, brushing a curl from Sophie's cheek. He had a daughter, a family, and a traitor sitting at the head of his dining table. Lorenzo stood up, his posture transforming. The broken lover vanished, and the boss of the Chicago syndicate returned. His eyes hardened into obsidian. Carmine had made a fatal miscalculation. He had left ghosts breathing. "Dante," Lorenzo barked without looking back, "clear the shop. Get a secure SUV to the back alley. We are moving them to the safe house in the Palisades." "And you, boss?" Dante asked, already moving to execute the orders. Lorenzo looked at Valerie, giving her a promise that carried the weight of a death sentence. "I have to go visit my uncle." The drive to the Costa family estate in Lake Forest took exactly 42 minutes. For Lorenzo, it felt like a lifetime. He sat in the back of the armored Cadillac Escalade, his posture rigid, staring blindly at the passing blur of wealthy suburban Chicago. The revelation at the Botanical Gardens was a poison working its way through his veins, burning away everything he thought he knew about loyalty and family. Carmine Costa was not just an uncle. He was the architect of Lorenzo's rise to power. When Lorenzo's father had been gunned down outside Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse 15 years ago, it was Carmine who had placed the heavy gold family ring on Lorenzo's finger. Carmine had taught him how to lead, how to strike without mercy, and, supposedly, how to protect their own. Matteo steered the heavy vehicle through the wrought iron gates of the sprawling stone mansion. "Boss," Matteo said quietly, glancing in the rearview mirror, "Carmine's detail is heavy today. He's got 6 men patrolling the perimeter. Something's got him spooked." "He knows I had a sit-down with Alderman Gregory," Lorenzo replied, his voice a deadened flatline. "He likely thinks I'm looking into the Southside construction bids. Let him think that. Park at the front." Lorenzo stepped out into the crisp Illinois afternoon. He didn't bother drawing his weapon. If he came in guns blazing, it would be a war. He needed it to be an execution. He bypassed the armed guards at the double mahogany doors with a curt nod. They stepped aside instantly for the boss. Lorenzo moved through the opulent foyer, his footsteps muffled by antique Persian rugs, heading straight for the study at the back of the house. He pushed the heavy oak doors open without knocking. Carmine was sitting behind a massive cherrywood desk, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 resting in his hand. He was a silver-haired, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s, radiating an aura of polished brutality. He looked up, a welcoming smile stretching across his weathered face. "Lorenzo, my boy." "I didn't expect you until Sunday dinner," Carmine said, gesturing to a leather armchair opposite him. "Drink?" Lorenzo didn't move. He closed the doors behind him, the heavy click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I went to the conservatory today, Carmine, to meet with Gregory." "Ah, yes. The permits. I assume the alderman was agreeable to our donation?" Carmine took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "He was," Lorenzo said smoothly, stepping fully into the room. He walked toward the fireplace, running a hand along the cold marble mantel. "But I found something else in the glass house. Uncle. Something that shouldn't have been there." Carmine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Oh? A stray tourist?" "A little girl," Lorenzo said, turning to face him. His eyes were void of any warmth. "A little girl with green eyes who told me her mother had a tattoo of a weeping willow and a silver dagger on her left shoulder blade." The silence in the study became absolute. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a rhythmic countdown to a violent end. Carmine slowly placed his tumbler on the desk. The paternal mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating snake underneath. "You found her," Carmine stated softly. It wasn't a question. "I buried a box of ashes, Carmine." Lorenzo's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I stood in the freezing rain and wept for a woman and an unborn child that you convinced me were dead. You told me the warehouse fire was an accident, a tragic electrical fault." Carmine let out a heavy sigh, steepling his fingers. "Lorenzo, you must understand. You were young. You were blinded by a civilian, a nobody. The Costa family is royalty in this city. You needed a wife from the commission, someone who understood the life, not some art appraiser who cried when she saw a loaded gun. I did what had to be done to protect the empire." By threatening to murder her and my unborn child? Lorenzo roared, the veneer of calm shattering. He slammed his fists onto Carmine's desk, causing the crystal tumbler to rattle. You sent her into hiding with $10,000 and a promise of death. I spared her. Carmine shot back, standing up to meet his nephew's fury. I could have killed her, Lorenzo, but I knew it would break you, so I gave her a way out. I protected this family. You protected your own pockets, Lorenzo hissed, stepping back. The puzzle had finally assembled itself in his mind during the car ride. It wasn't just about the bloodline. It never was with Carmine. It wasn't just that she was pregnant, was it? It was the Volkov shipment. Carmine's face went entirely ashen. Valerie was appraising the private collections we seized from the Gold Coast, Lorenzo continued, his voice dripping with lethal realization. She had a photographic memory for brushstrokes. She told me she found discrepancies in the Renaissance pieces you were handling. She found out you were replacing the originals with forgeries and selling the real ones to the Russians to line your own offshore accounts. She was going to tell me. Carmine opened his mouth, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the top drawer of his desk. You didn't fake her death to save the Costa bloodline, Lorenzo said, drawing his Sig Sauer in one fluid, blindingly fast motion. He leveled the barrel squarely at Carmine's chest. You did it to cover up that you were stealing from me. Lorenzo, Carmine pleaded, his hands raising in surrender, his eyes locked on the black hollow of the gun. I am your blood. I am your father's brother. You cannot do this. You lost the right to invoke my father's name the day you stole my daughter from me, Lorenzo said. Carmine lunged for the desk drawer. He never made it. Lorenzo pulled the trigger twice. The suppressed weapon let out two sharp coughs. Carmine fell backward, his chair tipping over with a heavy crash, spilling the Macallan across the polished cherry wood. Lorenzo stood over the body, his face an impassive mask. He holstered his weapon, the scent of cordite mixing with the expensive scotch. He pulled out his phone and dialed Matteo. Come into the study, Lorenzo ordered. Bring a cleanup crew. Carmine suffered a massive heart attack. It's a tragedy for the family. Understood, boss, Matteo replied without hesitation. Lorenzo walked out of the study, leaving the ghost of his uncle behind. He had a family to return to. The safe house in the Pacific Palisades was a fortress disguised as a mid-century modern architectural marvel. Perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, it was surrounded by high-tech security, armed men hidden in the tree line, and the deafening roar of the California surf. It had been 3 weeks since the incident at the Magnolia Cafe. 3 weeks since Lorenzo had dismantled Carmine's loyalists in Chicago, secured his empire, and flown across the country to the woman who still flinched when he entered a room. Lorenzo stood in the expansive kitchen, watching Valerie through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. She was sitting on the sun-drenched patio, a sketchbook in her lap, watching Sophie build a precarious tower out of wooden blocks. Valerie looked healthier. The dark circles under her eyes were fading, replaced by the golden tan of the coast, but the invisible wall between them remained thick and impenetrable. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, making hers with a splash of oat milk and half a sugar, a detail he had remembered for 7 years. He pushed open the sliding glass door, the salty sea breeze immediately ruffling his dark hair. Delivery, Lorenzo said softly, setting the mug on the small glass table next to her. Valerie paused her sketching, looking up at him. Her green eyes, so like Sophie's, held a mixture of lingering fear and profound exhaustion. Thank you, she murmured, taking the mug. Lorenzo sat in the chair opposite her. He wore a simple white Henley and linen pants. The intimidating tailored suits were locked away in Chicago. He wanted her to see the man, not the boss. Dante says the passports are cleared, Lorenzo offered quietly. If you want to go to Europe, to South America, anywhere. You have unlimited funds, Valerie. I told you, I'm not keeping you prisoner here. Valerie looked down at her coffee. And Sophie? She goes with you, Lorenzo said, the words tearing at his throat. It was the hardest concession he had ever made in his life. I will not rip a child away from her mother. I will fly out to see her whenever you allow it. I needed you to know you are safe. Carmine is dead. His men are gone. No one will ever hunt you again. Valerie took a slow, deep breath, her eyes tracking Sophie, who was now gleefully knocking over the wooden tower. When Carmine cornered me that day, Valerie began, her voice trembling slightly, he told me that if I ever reached out to you, he would send me your head in a box. He made me believe you were a monster who viewed me as trash. She looked up, meeting his gaze fully for the first time in weeks. But when I saw you drop to your knees in that cafe, when I saw you look at her, a tear slipped down her cheek. Lorenzo leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, to stop himself from reaching out and pulling her into his arms. He had to let her set the pace. I am a monster to a lot of people, Val, Lorenzo confessed, his voice rough with brutal honesty, but never to you, never to her. Hey, look at this. Sophie bounded over to them, holding up a large conch shell she had found near the cliff's edge fencing. She shoved it enthusiastically toward Lorenzo. Listen, you can hear the ocean inside it. Lorenzo smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that made him look 10 years younger. He took the shell and pressed it to his ear. You're right, it's loud. Sophie giggled, leaning against his leg casually. The child had adapted to his presence with terrifying ease, oblivious to the blood-soaked empire he ruled. She noticed his arm resting on the armrest and traced the weeping willow tattoo with her small finger. Mom said the tree means you're strong, Sophie said, looking up at him innocently. She said willows bend in the hurricane, but they don't break. Is that why you have the knife in it? To protect the tree? Lorenzo's breath hitched. He looked at Valerie, stunned. Valerie offered a small, tentative smile, wiping her cheek. I had to explain it to her somehow, over the years, why I had a matching mark with a ghost. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing over the ink on Lorenzo's arm, sending a jolt of electricity straight to his heart. Maybe it's time we stopped running from ghosts, Lorenzo. Lorenzo turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. The grip was solid, grounding, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt the freezing ice around his heart finally begin to melt in the California sun. Would you like me to show you the security protocols for the estate, or would you rather we take Sophie down to the beach? Lorenzo asked, offering a gentle path forward. Lorenzo stood on the balcony, watching Pacific waves crash against the shore. Inside, Valerie was reading to Sophie, their laughter floating through the open glass doors. The Chicago Syndicate was under new management, the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. He traced the weeping willow on his arm. It was no longer a monument to grief, but a living promise to the family he swore to always protect.